we go. And let me make sure the captions are on. Okay, so let's talk about some of the work that you've all been working on and what you need to do for the class this week. I haven't started grading the GeoHub assignment. I know several people had a hard time with it, so we'll see how those go. I have looked at a bunch of them. Everybody who's like the first 5 people who submitted, all like that was exactly what I was looking for. Whenever you're having trouble with one of these assignments, remember that you can reach out to me. I had a couple of people reach out to me, and I can try to give you an explanation of the assignment or instructions on how to do it over email, or I can always do a quick Zoom with people to go over it. But you also have the recordings. Don't forget that you can go back and look at all the recordings. So when I go over it in class, you can go back and look at those. They're always under attend. You have the link for the Zoom class, the link for my office hour, and then the recordings for the class. So you can always go back and look at those. This week, you have 2 readings on perusal and a Canvas assignment. So this one, because this week we're talking about Indigenous history. Oh, yes, Hopo? Did you have a question?
Yeah, so I had the same problem as I had on the other images where I couldn't see the
Okay.
image.
Okay, I will fix that right at the end of class then.
Oh, yeah.
What I did last time worked though? You were able to access the
Yeah,
image? Okay, all
yeah.
right, so I'll do the same thing in here. I don't know on this one why. I'm pretty sure on this one I had originally done, okay, but I will fix it.
Thank you.
Okay. So I'm asking you to analyze another image. And this time I'm telling you where this image comes from. So it's one that some of you might recognize. So we're going to talk about some of the history of Indigenous people in the US. But I also want you to go out and find a mural somewhere near where you live. I put Los Angeles because most of you live in Los Angeles County, but wherever it is you live, find a mural, some artwork in the community, and then write a paragraph talking about the significance of the mural you see, right? Because we walk by so much history in our everyday lives, but we're so used to it just being there that a lot of times we don't recognize it, right? Like we tend to think of the US as having not a very long history, because the US as a nation is not really that old, but this land has a really long history, and there's so much intermixing of different kinds of cultures, and we see that depicted in a lot of the murals that we have around town. And if you're really struggling, by the way, if you're like, there are no murals in my neighborhood, I never see any murals, any artwork, which one I would have a hard time believing that in Los Angeles. But if you're in another city, in another town, and you can't seem to find one of the things that I will remind you is that Cal State LA has artwork. In our walls and our murals, there's artwork all over campus. So you can pick something from campus if you really don't want to like talk about something in your neighborhood, or you have a hard time finding something. So for question 3, you can pick something from Cal State LA. Neighborhood just has graffiti. Graffiti counts. Graffiti counts. There is one. There's usually a history in those murals, and if the graffiti is art-like, it can be interpreted as art. So you can use that, but if you don't want to use that, you can pick something from campus. I'm also asking you to do a little bit of research, like how much do you know about the Indigenous people that were on what is now Los Angeles before all of us? Most people don't know very much, so I'm asking you to do some research on that, right? On the Indigenous issues that exist in Los Angeles today. Right, so that question number 2 is not a history question. It's a one about what Indigenous issues can you find by doing an online search today. They're the ones for gang turfs. Yeah, See, but with graffiti, it can usually be groups trying to assert their control of certain territories, but you can see often the history of that in the graffiti itself, like the different groups, the different kinds of violence that exist in a community. You can usually see it in those graffiti in the graffiti that you see around neighborhoods. But again, I'm like, you don't have to pick something like that. Pick something from campus. If like looking around your neighborhood, all you see is that kind of graffiti. Yeah. So that's the assignment. So the thing that will take the longest is probably doing research on those issues that Indigenous communities are interested in Los Angeles County, and then finding that mural. The question number one is just analyzing this particular image. So I'm not going to go through. I'm going to let you come up with whatever interpretations you have and connections you make of the mural. You also have two different readings, but don't despair. One of the readings is extremely, extremely short. I'm having you read President Andrew Jackson's message to Congress on Indian removal. It's a little bit before the start date of our class, but it's really important when we're talking about Indigenous history. Andrew Jackson is like the key figure when talking about Indigenous history. And so we have to look at what he said to Congress about explaining the removal of Indigenous people, right? This one, you might want to come in and add your comments early because it's such a short document. It's going to get filled up with the highlights really quickly. I already see a ton in here. This first image, I wanted to show you what the document looks like that people usually are reading. Yeah. I know. Okay. Yeah. That's what Horo was telling me, that the image is not visible. So I'm going to go in immediately after class and replace that image so that you can see it. Yes, you can absolutely, Angel, already comment on a highlight that somebody else already made. Yes. Yes. So this first document is the way the document actually looks. Like we have the physical document with Andrew Jackson's speech to Congress. Can any of you make out words from this? Maybe if we zoom in. I wanted to just give you a taste of the kinds of documents people, historians look like. No, part of it is the handwriting, right? It's cursive. And fortunately, most of you, I think most of you were not even taught cursive in school. I think my generation was the last one that was taught cursive in school. I was taught cursive, but it's pretty useless to be taught cursive, except if you're going to become a historian and you want to read documents like this because they're written in cursive and they're hard to read when you're not used to doing that. So usually historians have to take a document like this and transcribe it. Right? They have to transcribe it so that it's legible. After that page, though, you have a summary. This is just historical information on Andrew Jackson and Indian removal. Down here is what the document actually says, right? Once you see the heading transcript, this is Andrew Jackson's actual words to Congress. And what will strike you, I think, is how there are no dog whistles here. There's no hidden message. He's very straightforward about what he thinks about Indigenous people. And that might feel a little bit jarring, but I'm like, this is why sometimes when we have fights over how to teach certain history, sometimes it's puzzling to me because some of this history is not hidden. It's very clear, and historians have been discussing this history for a long time. When it comes to Andrew Jackson and Indian removal, there's no hidden message. It's very, very clear. Some of you were taught cursive. See, that's very interesting. Okay, so this is a very short reading, right? And very straightforward. But the other reading for the week is to continue reading from Hinojosa's Once I Was You. And I want to talk about the first few chapters that you all already read for Hinojosa. So I want to see what you think so far. So tell me, what were your first impressions of Hinojosa's book? Did you like it? Did you hate it? Is it hard to read? Was it easy to read? See, some of you were taught. That's interesting, cursive. Most people are. My understanding is that most people are not taught cursive these days. If you were, it was probably you had a teacher or a district that was very focused on that. So tell me about Hinojosa. What stood out to you from the first 3 chapters and introduction? Ha, your mom actually. So see, not in school. Okay, that explains it. No, nothing from Hinojosa? No, nothing stood out to any of you. You all made comments on it. So presumably something stood out. I enjoy if she'd had drawings. Yes, she actually does have a children's version of this that I'm pretty sure does have images. I have no, by the way, I think graphic novels, there's a new trend recently in history of creating graphic historical graphic novels, historical graphic novels, and they're really, really excellent. You read that instead. You still have to read this one. So one of the things to consider, by the way, like there are moments in the reading in which it is explicitly giving you history, right? For example, chapter 3 at the very end, when she talks about, let's see which president, Richard Nixon. She talks about Richard Nixon, and she talks about Johnson, President Johnson, Eisenhower. Like whenever she's mentioning presidents, those are things that should stand out to you as she's giving us a version of history. But even in those moments, right, it might feel a little bit like traditional history, because the way the U.S. history used to be taught was basically to go through the precedents and tell you what important political moments occurred during the presidency. But she's not focusing on all of the traditional history we talk about, right? For example, a lot of things that are not used to not be taught in classes was Operation Wetback, for example. I don't like using that word because it is a slur, but that was what they named the operation. They named it Operation Wetback. Who remembers what that was? What was Operation Wetback? Did nobody get to chapter 3? No, I know people did get to chapter 3 because it's people made comments. I'm gonna need to find the page where that is at. Because not everybody gets taught this, but I know some of you did have going to school in LA County schools. I know some of you were taught this history, but what was Operation Wetback in the 1950s? Some of you know you're just checking. So it's in the 50s. It's this movement to deport people that initially it was supposed to be to deport people that had come into the US illegally, right? This is when the term illegal alien begins to be used, right? And it was supposed to be a term that was better, at least than wetback, right? Because that is a very derogatory term. And so it's around that time that there's a push to stop using the word wetback, especially by the government, right? In the 1950s, they called this Operation Wetback. So there's a push to change it to talk about illegal alien instead of wetback. But what ends up happening is that they're not just deporting people who entered the US illegally, they were deporting people who just looked brown, that looked Mexican, that looked Latino. And this had already occurred in the US before, in the 30s and 40s during the Depression, when there was a lack of jobs. One of the targets for people were migrant workers, especially working in the fields. And so there was large deportations of people, some who might have entered the country illegally, but a lot who were not. And basically, they didn't care right? They were still deporting people, even if they had been born in the US. And so it speaks to the kind of racism that supports these kinds of actions. These kinds of actions were extremely popular in the US. One, because immigrants are always easy targets whenever there is an economic downturn, right? If things are not if the country's not doing well economically, immigrants make for an easy target. It's easy to blame them for the bad economic conditions, when in reality, usually has very little to do with that. with that, but that has occurred at several points in American history of citizens being deported, regardless of their immigration status. And so the fact that she's talking about it in her book is noteworthy, right? For some of you, if you learn this history, it might not stand out as, hey, this is important history, or she's telling history in a different way. But she is telling us this history in a different way. By talking about the language that is used to talk about immigrants, she is telling us a history that is not typically taught in schools. Right. Sometimes we are privileged because you might live somewhere where you had teachers, where you had districts that were interested in changing the narrative in the way we teach history. But for most of Americans, even today, this is not a history that is taught in classrooms. Right. But she is giving it to you in a form that also tells you her personal story. Right. It also comes in more subtle ways. For example, at the very beginning, before chapter 1, when she is introducing the story, right, she starts with a letter to the girl at McAllen Airport. She starts with the story of her more recently, 2019. She's at an airport and she sees a group of minors, of children that are being transported by government officials. Right. At that time, she knows exactly what that is because she's been reporting on the issue of unaccompanied minors coming to the US-Mexico border. And then how families were being separated at the border. And then there was the big question of what our government was doing with all of these unaccompanied minors and with the separation of families. And she sees these children and she wants to talk to them, right? And she makes the effort to talk to them and to talk to the government officials that were in charge of transporting these children. That is history, right? Even though it happened recently, even though it happened during our lifetime, it's history. It will one day end up in the history books, maybe not in all history books, but that is part of a history that will tell a particular story about our country, right? And what I'm asking you for your final paper in this class is to tell me what version of US history does that tell us, right? Might not be a pretty history, but what version of it do you think that tells us? So that first story, it stood out to so many of you. I saw so many of you write comments on that first introduction. So if that stood out to you, write yourself a note. Hey, when writing the final paper, go back to the story. Right. So just to remind you that on the right-hand side, there's a navigation here for writing yourself notes. Right over here with the pencil mark, you can write yourself notes on here. You just have to click new or open so that you can write yourself a note. This is really important for helping your future self out, so you don't have to come back and reread everything. Are there any questions about the reading so far about Hinojosa? Someone in the comments? No? Okay. Hopefully it's meant to be easier to read, right? She's a reporter. She typically writes so that the audience can, so that it's accessible for people. But especially for college students, this should be easy reading. But because it's not very academic, it doesn't mean you're going to be able to read it fast necessarily. The speed in which you read it does not matter. What I'm hoping is that you're getting some of this, the telling of history from it. All right. If there's no other questions or comments, and you can always come back and ask them, by the way. I'm going to move on. Today, I really did want to spend the week talking about Indigenous history. And I don't like doing this. I'm like, there's only going to be 1 week in which we talk about Indigenous people. No, we're going to come back to this, but I want to dedicate some time to talking about some of the background, because our class doesn't start till 1877 technically, but to talk about what is happening to Indigenous people after 1877, we need to know some of what occurred before, right? It's key. And I find that this is still somewhere where even in districts that do a really good job of teaching history in a much more accessible way, and teaching history that isn't normally taught, we still don't do a great job talking about Indigenous history. I see it even at the graduate level. When I got my PhD, Indigenous history was not something that was naturally taught in a lot of our courses. It was something that we had to seek out on our own. And it's critical for an understanding of American history, right? When you look at what we now call the US, right, we have to talk about how it came to exist. And it only came to exist because something was done about the people that were already in this land, right? What happened to them? And what has continued to happen to Indigenous communities, even after 1848. Or 1853. I was trying to find the latest acquisition. So key, right, for the creating of the United States, right, is this westward expansion, right? We think of it as westward expansion because the original 13 colonies were in the East Coast, right? So it's a process of this territory expanding west. Well, in the process of these colonists expanding westward, what are they encountering in this territory? What are Indigenous people doing here? Are they just, hey, come over here, colonists, there's plenty of land? Are they welcoming the colonists? No. In fact, in most of this territory, there's already warfare going on for who controls these territories, right? The France believed that they controlled most of the what is now the central US. They really controlled mostly down here, Louisiana, what is now New Orleans, right? They'd been traveling up and down the Mississippi River, doing fur trading down here, but the French never completely dominated that territory. Then in the West Coast or in the Southwest, the Spanish were trying to control this territory. And so they were already engaging in warfare and with Indigenous people here, and attempts at enslaving Indigenous people, right? When we look at California history and the history of the missions, what we're talking about is forced conversion and the enslavement of Indigenous people. So that is happening all over the Southwest. Some areas are Indigenous people are mostly being left alone because there's just not that many Europeans making their way there. So like large parts of what becomes the Louisiana Purchase, Indigenous people can more or less move freely. But the closer you get to any kind of settlement, the harder it is for people to live there, and the more warfare you find, right? We tend to think of the domination of the Americas, right? How Europeans come to dominate so much of the Americas as them just like instinctively or kind of easily controlling this territory, but it was not an easy task, right? In fact, initially, Indigenous people had the upper hand, right? When these colonists first arrive in what it becomes the 13 original colonies, they needed the help of Indigenous people just to survive. So they would have never survived without Indigenous help. And Indigenous people did help the colonists initially, in some cases, because they wanted to actually help, and they didn't see there was no danger in helping a small group of people that were trying to settle there. Other times, though, Indigenous people recognized the threat of white Europeans, and they did not help those colonists, right? And especially as these colonies expanded, Indigenous people fought for that territory, right? Things that we don't have time to go into a great detail of, but for example, big factors here were disease, right? European diseases devastated indigenous populations. And so it meant that as the population of indigenous people went down, that they had less people to fight with. That becomes a major factor when fighting over territory. But otherwise, they had the upper hand a majority of the time, even with the Europeans having essentially better killing weapons, right? Having bullets, having that firepower. Indigenous people still had the upper hand in those fights because they knew the territory so much better. So it's other factors that end up playing a role that benefits Europeans in control over the Americas. In the US in particular, right, this is a vast amount of land, right? Making it from the East Coast to the West Coast, or even through what was Spanish territory in Latin America, was very difficult, right? We know that when people were doing it with wagons, that they were often dying partway through their journeys. So what ends up happening in the 19th century, right, is that things change. Major technological changes make traveling across this land possible. It makes the European movement around these territories much easier, and it's devastating for indigenous people, right? One was transportation, right? I'm going to skip down here and come back to the cotton gin. Turnpikes, canals, railroads. Railroads completely revolutionized the way people traveled. They're still important today, by the way. It's one of the major ways in which we get goods across the country. But in the 19th century, they're super important for helping get people across this territory. If the US hadn't gotten all of these white Americans to make this move across the US, there wouldn't have never been enough white Europeans or people of white European ancestry to control land that was very well controlled by indigenous people, right? Now, why are people making that move? I know you all have the answer to this. Why were people that maybe landed in these original 13 colonies, or why would they want to move west? Especially when they're traveling through territory controlled by indigenous people. Why would anybody want to make this move? Manifest destiny. Yes, it's this God-given idea, this idea that God gave them the right to control this territory. So that is definitely a major part of it. But also, yes, those of you who are saying gold, when gold is discovered in California, they want to get rich just as much as everybody else. So that is a huge motivator to expand. Some of them are doing it for the kind of adventure of it. Some adventurers are coming across because it's rough territory, right? They want to fight with Indians and encounter those dangers. But most people are probably not doing it out of a sense of adventure. They have to be willing to encounter all of that, but they're doing it usually for financial reasons. And gold is a major one, and then land. Yes, Andrew, land. That is the key, especially once cotton becomes easier to grow in the South, right? Cotton was really on its way out, right? Cotton had a big boom in the 1700s. It was very profitable, but part of the problem with growing cotton is that you had to take out the seeds by hand. So slave labor was used to take the seeds out of the cotton by hand. So before it can be turned, that cotton can be turned into cloth or into anything, all those seeds had to be taken out. Well, that was very hard work. And even with enslaved labor doing that, it was still not profitable enough by the time you get to the end of the 1700s. But that changes when the cotton gin is invented and becomes accessible to plantation owners, right? The cotton gin makes it so that a machine is taking out the seeds. So now growing plantations is ideal. Anybody who already had land, for example, where they could grow cotton, they want more land. So that actually helps increase the need for land, right? All these plantation owners in the South want more land so they can grow more cotton because they're making tons of money out of it. And now the cotton gin has made it even more profitable, right? Other people who might not own large chunks of land for plantations want that land, right? They see how profitable it is for plantation owners and they want their own chunk of land where they can grow cotton, but things are getting kind of crowded in the South. It's also expensive to in areas of the South to kind of clear new land, but the U.S. makes it really easy to move west, right? Especially in places like what is now Texas, where there is large amount of land and where it seems pretty easy to take that territory. Even though this is technically controlled by the Spanish and there are indigenous people there, people are moving over here. So basically, because they want more land, they're looking for land, or they're making it west for the gold rush, or just a lack of opportunities in the East Coast, right? That is made possible by railroads. So once we have railroads, that increases the amount of people moving across exponentially, just exponentially. But it all is occurring, right? It's completely dependent on appropriating native land, right? And the expansion of slavery, because growing that cotton requires, they believe requires slave labor, right? It is completely changing the demographics of this territory, though. All of this territory is dramatically shifting in demographically. Well, I said Andrew Jackson is key when doing any kind of indigenous history of the U.S. There's this big moment here with Andrew Jackson. It is very clear he's on this path, right? That's going to lead him to Indian removal from a very early point in his life. In 1803, we actually have letters between Thomas Jefferson and Andrew Jackson, right? Talking about the question of Native people, right? What are we going to do with these indigenous people? Well, Thomas Jefferson advises Andrew Jackson that indigenous people need to be convinced to sell their land, and that they should be convinced because it is useless land. Now, Thomas Jefferson knows this is not useless land, right? That all of this is not useless. It's very useful land. But Thomas Jefferson believes that indigenous people could be potentially convinced to settle down, and instead of being more nomadic, to settle down and become farmers. And he thinks that would benefit the U.S. if indigenous people become farmers, then large chunks of land become available, right? Instead of indigenous people controlling huge territories, they're going to control smaller chunks of land for farming. Will open up a lot of territory. So it's not Thomas Jefferson thinking that, hey, indigenous people will benefit from becoming farmers. No, it's that the U.S. and white Americans will benefit if indigenous people will stop becoming a problem. Right. So Jackson begins doing land speculation in what is now Nashville, right, in Tennessee. Right. So he is buying up as much land as he can find, because he knows that the way the situation is moving, that land he can make a profit out of it. Right. So he ends up buying 2,500 acres of Chickasaw Bluffs on the Mississippi. So this is near Tennessee on what is now the Mississippi. I'm sorry, I'm scrolling back so you can see the map of some of the locations we're talking about. Land near water is especially valuable, right? Especially if you're going to turn that land into farmland, because it gives you easy access to water. So any land that's near any of these rivers is going to be extremely, extremely valuable, right? He buys that land for $100. It's nothing. Even when talking about the value of dollars at that point, he's buying it extremely cheaply. He sells half of it for $312. So he initially sells half of it, and he's already made a profit off of it. The rest of the land he sells for $5,000. Right? So this is half of the land he bought for $100. So he becomes wealthy from land speculation and from the land that belonged to indigenous people, right? So part of it is like people debate what his personal opinion is on indigenous people. Some people used to talk about him as having complex views of indigenous people, right? Because he adopted an indigenous child. So he does adopt an indigenous child and raises him as his son. But when you look at everything else in his personal story, it is clear that there is no one understanding of indigenous people, understanding of land belonging to indigenous people. And when you read his address to Congress this week, you'll see that he does not have any good things or good opinions about indigenous people, right? And it's not just a profit-based opinion. It's not just that, he's making money off of it, so he's going to say bad things about people that are on the land he wants to buy or that he sees as profitable. It's also this was common at the time, right? To view indigenous people as less than, right? People believed that indigenous people were uncivilized and not using the land properly. But that's a very convenient opinion to have when you want their land. However, Andrew Jackson does more than just, make money off of indigenous land and have a very racist view of indigenous people. His presidency is largely backed by people that see in him a supporter of taking indigenous land, right? When he is elected, he is heavily supported by people from Georgia, white settlers in Georgia and Mississippi, right? Because they know he is anti-indigenous. He has these anti-indigenous views, and they see in him an ally that would allow the abolishing of tribal units. So already there were indigenous people that had made treaties with the U.S. government and with state governments, right? So these were negotiations between indigenous people and these governments about, hey, we're going to allow you to keep some of this land, right? Indigenous people were going to allow the settlers to keep the land they had, but the agreements usually required that colonists did not expand, that they respect native land borders, right? So in exchange for letting the colonists that were already there keep their land, indigenous people required that they don't expand further, right? Well, people in Georgia and Mississippi were not happy with that. They wanted to grow their plantations. They want access to more of that land. And they know that Andrew Jackson, if they support him in the election, that he's gonna be okay with breaking those treaties. Right? Now, breaking those treaties is unconstitutional at this point. The Supreme Court had already ruled that the federal government and local governments had to respect those laws, those treaties that had been negotiating with indigenous people. But the thing about the Supreme Court at any point in history is that their job is just to decide what's constitutional and what's not. They have no enforcement power. Right? The Supreme Court has no enforcement power. And if you have a president who is not going to enforce a Supreme Court decision, then that's beneficial to you if you are in Georgia or Mississippi trying to acquire more land. And so with the heavy support from Georgia and Mississippi, Andrew Jackson is elected in 1828. And he not only allows for the breaking of these treaties that had been negotiated with the indigenous peoples there, but he goes even further, right? And organizes the forced removal of indigenous people from their native lands, right? Part of his motivation is he believes that indigenous people cannot live with whites, that you cannot have harmony, peaceful harmony between whites and indigenous people. Right? So if you believe that people cannot live next to each other, then what are you going to do when they are living next to each other? Well, move people, right? And the initial solution, let me go back to the map, is to move people to the other side of the Mississippi, right? The initial removal of indigenous people is to remove them from the southern territories, so especially from Georgia and Mississippi, to the other side of the river, right? Crossing the river is not super easy yet, and so the initial solution is like, let's just move them all west of the Mississippi. Let's just dump them on the other side. Eventually, that's not going to be enough, right? But initially, it's let's move everybody west. So indigenous people were not just going to accept that, though, right? They have treaties, legal treaties that the Supreme Court says are legal and binding. And so people fight the attempt at removal, right? But really quickly, right? Almost immediately after the election of Andrew Jackson, Georgia initially breaks the treaty with the Cherokee Nation, and Georgia gives the Cherokee Nation two options: you either leave on your own, or we will force you to leave. Right? Mississippi does the same thing. They abolish Choctaw sovereignty, right, and gives them the same choice: you either leave, or we will forcibly remove you. Right? Now, indigenous people are not just gonna like say, "Okay, Americans, you have all the power." No, they fought back. People didn't leave. Right? Indigenous people didn't just leave because the states gave them an ultimatum. They were organizing, fighting back. Part of the problem, though, is at this point, most of the population of the Cherokee Nation in Choctaw has been heavily devastated. And so the number of people that existed to fight back are less than it would take to fight back from the American military at that point. So Andrew Jackson organizes the U.S. military to go down to Georgia, Mississippi, and Florida and remove the Cherokee and Choctaw people from their territory and dump them west of the Mississippi. Right? Now, removing people was expensive. Oop. Is anybody else having trouble hearing me? Let me know in the chat.
I hear all good.
Okay. Then the problem's not on my end then, Jackson, but remember that this is being recorded. So removing people was really expensive. Look at how much. The problem for indigenous people is that as expensive as it was to get the U.S. military to go down there and to move people by force, the profit is so much greater. So there's a huge incentive then for Andrew Jackson to do this, and it occurs, right? Violently occurs, right? When we look at, for example, genocides that have occurred through history, it is very clear that what happens with the forced removal of indigenous people in 1830, it fits the definition of genocide. Right? Indigenous people were rounded up, forced to take only what they could carry, and marched west of the Mississippi. Right? When they were being marched west of the Mississippi, the U.S. military was not providing them food and water. If somebody was getting sick, which did occur, somebody got sick as they were being marched, they would be left to die on the road. In fact, it was preferred. Part of the reason for forcing people to walk, right, to march them west of the Mississippi, was to make sure that people died. Right? That is typically the point of these long marches, right, was to force people to die. That way you have less people to deal with. It costs as much as California gas. Yes, they're hilarious. So they're march westward by force, right? Now, that doesn't mean every single Choctaw and Cherokee member is forcibly removed. When the community wanted to stay together, then those are the people that, you know, are marched together. But they were especially a lot of single men that end up escaping and becoming a problem for the U.S. military. But by and large, people are marched, killed on the march, or then left west of the Mississippi. So, okay, when all of the people that survive the march make it west of the Mississippi, what do they find? Nothing. No provisions is made for them to live anywhere. They have to basically figure it out on their own. In land that was not their ancestral home. So they don't know. So for these members of the Cherokee and Choctaw Nation, this is new land that they don't know how to live off of, that is completely different than what they're used to. And so there's a lot of deaths in trying to figure it out again, because they're not given any kind of compensation. There's no attempt to make sure that people have food and water, nothing, right? Because really what the plan was to kill as many indigenous people as possible. And that, by the way, that is why I'm having you read Andrew Jackson's address to Congress. I think it is very clear in his address to Congress that that is the goal. Killing as many indigenous people as part of this removal process was the goal, and he's very straightforward, I think, in his document on that. I do want to talk about resistance, though, because I think as important as it is to talk about this kind of genocide, it's just as important to talk about how people didn't just sit back and accept this at any point. At any point in U.S. history, did indigenous people just accept genocide and the taking of their land? From the very beginning is not what they were accepting, right? We see it in the earliest interactions between Europeans coming to the Americas and indigenous people, right? Does anybody know anything about the lost Roanoke colony? This is a story that comes up a lot on like conspiracy theories. So if you watch any of those like conspiracy theory shows, usually they'll have an episode on the lost Roanoke colony. No, oh, so it's this colony of British people that land on what is now Massachusetts, right? Roanoke. And they have a really hard time making like staying alive. They're not used to hunting, gathering. They brought in supplies, but the winter that year when they land in Roanoke is extremely harsh. So the winter uses up most of their supplies, so they run out of all the food and water supplies that they had brought with them to Roanoke. So by the time new colonists arrive, so after that horrible winter, by the time you get to the next summer, when it is actually possible for new people to arrive, eventually new British colonists arrive. They find the homes, the huts made by those initial colonists, but nobody's there. They find an empty village, essentially. They find not a single survivor of the initial colonists. So they have long debated what happened to this colony. Well, in reality, that's not the full story. These colonists arrive in 1585, or after that winter of 1585, and there was actually evidence that the last survivors of the Roanoke colony left a note telling them where they went. It's kind of a cryptic note because they they probably don't have much time to leave any note. Most of the colony at that point had already died, but the indigenous people of one of the islands in Massachusetts rescues the last remaining survivors of that Roanoke colony. It is clear in deciphering the message those colonists left that they were taken in by indigenous people. But what ends up happening whenever in these early stories of indigenous people helping colonists, a lot of times they're bringing them into the community, into their communities, and then those colonists assimilate into indigenous life. And that was typical of the way indigenous tribes worked at the time, is that whenever they raided another tribal group, right, another indigenous group, there would be a war or fighting with those. They would kill some people, and then any survivors would be brought into their communities and assimilated into their tribal groups. So that's what happened with a lot of these very early colonists that are saved by indigenous people, right? When some of these colonies, though, some of these early colonies got too big, right, and clearly a threat to indigenous people would raid those colonies, right? There would be attacks, military attacks on those colonies. And we know because the colonists are writing about it. Whenever you read the journal entries and the letters of colonists from the early, the late 1500s and the 1600s, that one of the things that they're constantly writing about is the threat of indigenous raids on their colony, right? Sometimes these raids would be extremely successful. They would kill most of the men in the colony and then take the children, which was the way some of these tribes operated within indigenous warfare, was to kill the men, take the children, because the children can be raised as members of the community, right? And so there's a lot of that in the sources, writing about the kidnapping of children by indigenous communities. And those children would be raised as members of the indigenous group. Once they were old enough, the children, if they wanted to leave the indigenous group, if they wanted to rejoin the white colonists, they could. A few of them end up doing that, and they become like kind of noteworthy in some of the sources. But a lot of those children, no, they marry within the indigenous community, and for all intents and purposes are indigenous. The other thing that was really common in terms of fighting back against white colonists was stealing. You see it especially in the sources of California. Indigenous groups are really good at raiding missions. Like they would come in at night, they would attack the mission, take all the horses, as many horses as they could find. They would steal supplies, and then disappear into the countryside, because they knew the land so much better than the Spanish missionaries. They were able to do that very successfully. Mm-hmm. Yeah, we haven't had a question yet. It's coming though. So because they did that, then very successfully, it was always a problem. It was always a problem for the colonists. This was happening all over, right? It was happening with the Spanish colonists and with the English colonists, the French and the Dutch that were all over what is now the US. And a lot of these colonists were writing back to the European monarchs, right, to the people that were funding them in Europe. And they were saying, hey, we're having this huge problem with indigenous people. Like, help us. One, send us more supplies. They're constantly in need of more and more supplies from Europe in order to survive, and because their supplies keep getting raided by indigenous groups. And they're always complaining about how slow those Europeans are back home in sending them supplies back to the colony, right? So it was actually really effective. Stealing from these colonists was very effective for indigenous groups, because then you don't even have to kill them. Once you take all their supplies, they're going to die out on their own because they don't know how to live off the land. The other big things, and this is where my question is going to come up, Yeah, horses. Because horses, by the way, horses were not native to the Americas, right? The Americas did not have horses. They are brought to the Americas by the Europeans, but they become such an effective tool in warfare that whoever had horses had the upper hand in warfare. When indigenous groups see that all over the Americas, when they see how important horses are, they immediately adapt to them, right? They figure out how to raise, how to train horses, and they actually end up doing it probably better than some of these Europeans were doing it. Yeah. The horses, by the way, are also not indigenous to Western Europe. The horse was initially kind of adopted by humans and trained by humans in what is now Central Asia. So like by nomadic groups in Central Asia. The other big thing that indigenous people did to fight back, to resist the colonization of their land, occurs during times of war. When the American Revolution breaks out, a lot of indigenous groups sided with the British. When the Civil War breaks out, indigenous people sided with the Confederacy. Why? So this is the question of the day. So tell me, why do you think indigenous people would side with the British during the American Revolution and then side with the Confederacy during the Civil War? Why? Because we could say during the Civil War, there were some indigenous groups that had slaves, that had enslaved Black people, that had Black slaves. Not very many, but there were some. But there were indigenous groups who did not have slaves and still sided with the Confederacy. How would that help them in their resistance, right? So the question is, why would indigenous groups side with the British and side with the Confederacy during these wars? All right, let me see. Oh, I'm already seeing the correct answers. Yep. Oh, the Confederacy was the South in the Civil War, the war between the South and the North. So the Southern states that seceded from the Union were called the Confederacy. So that's what I'm talking about. So during the Civil War, they sided not with Abraham Lincoln, not with the anti-slavery movement. They sided with the pro-slavery side, with the Confederacy. Okay. So see some
Can you repeat the question, please?
Yeah. So why would indigenous people side with the British during the American Revolution and with the Confederacy during the Civil War? So I'm asking you for what you think. I'll put it in the chat. Why do you think why do you think indigenous groups sided with the British during the American Revolution and the Confederacy during the Civil War? So those of you that had heard the question, I'm seeing the answers, and you're getting it right. So one of the things that happens during the American Revolution is that the British promise indigenous groups that they will stop the westward expansion, that they would keep the colonies where they're at. Right? The Americans are fighting to kind of in opposition to British control of the Americas. They were actually opposing some of the British laws that already required or prevented them from moving west. There were already laws that prevented those original colonies from growing, and they wanted that land. So part of what creating a United States, an independent United States, meant indigenous people knew that it would mean taking indigenous land. Yes, and it didn't mean that the British were particularly pro-indigenous. They were not. They were just seeing a benefit. Like, we can promise indigenous people that we will stop the westward expansion of these colonies so that they can help us, so that they can join our efforts. And indigenous warriors did join the British in some of these battles. They understood the land better, so they could help the British in that way. Obviously, the bigger factor in the American Revolution, though, was the French involvement, French aid to the revolutionaries. But indigenous people did help the British. When it comes to the Civil War, right? So some of you asked the question that maybe they agreed, and I'm like, there were some indigenous, like the Choctaw groups that did own slaves. So they did kind of more. They didn't see, there was nothing incompatible in the way that they behaved that was incompatible with the slavery in the South. For other indigenous groups, though, it wasn't that. They didn't have Black slaves, and they might not have even had any slaves whatsoever at that point. They were just siding with the Confederacy because they knew that part of Lincoln's plan was westward expansion. And in fact, it was. One of the things that Lincoln is able to do when the South secedes is make a plan for the railroads that goes through the northern states and not through the southern states. When you look at the Transcontinental Railroad, notice where it goes through. That Transcontinental Railroad does not go through any of the southern states because the plan was made, the project was approved by Congress during the Civil War, right? All the congressmen and senators that would have opposed that plan had seceded, so they got no say on the railroad. But indigenous people knew that if Lincoln won the presidency, that it meant westward expansion. So it's actually, for them, the Civil War was a good thing because it was going to delay any westward expansion. And in fact, if the Confederacy won, they believed it would delay any westward expansion as well. We don't know if that's actually what would have happened, but they believe that it was in their best interest to join the Confederacy. So as a result, then a lot of indigenous groups either help the Confederacy or they stay out of it, right? They just decide to not stay neutral and see if the Confederacy can beat the Union. Oh, Jackson, I have a slightly unrelated question. If America had lost the revolution, do we think the British would have been successful in maintaining control of the colonies and stopping westward expansion? Probably not. They would have, because they were already having a hard time controlling westward expansion. There were already colonists establishing or taking control of land illegally. That was part of the problem. They were already illegally taking land that the British had said they couldn't take. So probably not. It's interesting, though, to think if the British had won, what might have happened, especially in terms of slavery, because the British made the slave trade illegal much earlier than the U.S. did. In terms of that one, it would have been interesting, the dynamic. So at some point, though, I think the Americans were gonna rebel anyways because of what the kinds of laws that the British Empire begins passing that would have never been okay with the American colonists. But remember that the American colonists they were actually in a privileged position when it comes to the British Empire. Mostly the American colonists were being allowed to do whatever they wanted. With the British so far away and so few British soldiers in the original 13 colonies, they were just not able to enforce things the way they were in other parts of the world. they were sending most of their troops to other places where that military power gave them the upper hand. And the Americans, they were being much more hands off. Any other questions? I'm like, because this is really interesting history to me. The relationship between indigenous groups and the different European and colonists is really interesting because it's complex. Whenever they can, indigenous people are making decisions that are to their benefit. They're not just giving in to westward expansion. They're trying to negotiate, right? In places where they know that they don't have the upper hand, the next best tactic is to negotiate. So when they know that they've lost control of certain parts, they engage in negotiations that benefited them, right? To try to keep the colonies contained and give them at least control over some land. The problem is, at every step of the way, the American government breaks those treaties. They never respect those treaties for very long. And that happens all the way until the present. Today, the US government is still breaking some of the treaties that they have with indigenous people, right? For example, to build pipelines. So that's where some of the most recent controversies have occurred when pipeline projects go through indigenous land and indigenous people don't want the pipeline to go through their land. And then companies and the federal government try to step in to force the pipeline through indigenous land. And so we'll get to that, but it's going to be a constant issue in the history of indigenous people in the US. Okay, I will stop the recording